As you remember, we were studying the drivers in a supply chain. We understood that the facility is one driver, inventory, and transportation. And they were among 3 logistical drivers. In addition to those 3 drivers, we have 3 other drivers. One of them is information. In the last session at the end, we just reached to information as one of the drivers. And I mentioned that by having information in our supply chain, we can come up with a better coordination of our infrastructure, flow of material into the supply chain, and simultaneously we can improve the responsiveness and also efficiency of our supply chain. So this is the only drivers that simultaneously can address responsiveness and efficiency of supply chain. And the 2 successful example of excellent information system in a supply chain is 7-Eleven in Japan and Walmart. That they are kind of successful case of applying information system in sharing and coordinating of information flow into a supply chain. So as I said, this is a key driver that we can use to improve efficiency and responsiveness, but we need to be careful because we have to share right information to satisfy the customer demand. And of course, the cost will be one of our concerns in designing and deploying information system. And by having an information system, we want to improve the visibility of transaction across the whole supply chain. And also we want to coordinate our decision into the supply chain. And the other side, there is some kind of misunderstanding. Sometimes the practitioner, they are thinking that more information is always better. But this is not the case. Sometimes information will be too much information, and it's just bringing complexity, too much complexity, and also that will impose you a huge cost of infrastructure for your information system. So we have to keep minimum amount of information which is required to achieve the coordination between stage in the supply chain. So we are not going to apply or implement one information system for a supply chain to get all possible information. No, we are just acquiring the information which are necessary for coordination between the stage. Too much information, it means that too much complexity, and then it's just making more difficult for the coordination purposes. And I mentioned that for the information system, one decision could be related to push or pull view in your cycle. If you are dealing in a kind of cyclic view, and if you consider a push system, so in a push system, in one cycle, you have a supplier and customer in each cycle, if you remember from the cyclic view of supply chain. So if the system is a kind of push system, it means that we are just going to have some forecast of the demand of the customer, and based on the forecast, the operation will be a start. So the supplier will start the production schedule based on some forecast, and based on the forecast, some plans will be shifted to other suppliers. But in a pull system, we are waiting for the receiving the information regarding the actual demand. So in a pull system, I mean, the demand is just announced by the customer, and based on that, the information that we are receiving, we should immediately respond to that demand from the customer. So this is important. So I'm just trying to say that in push system and in pull system, for sure you have to keep information shared with supplier and customer. But in a push system, the originating of the sharing of the information will be started from the kind of supplier. But in a pull system, the information will be shared from the customer to the supplier. So, I mean, in both systems, I'm saying that sharing information is necessary. In push system, the originating or initial sharing information will start from supplier, and then that will goes to the customer. But in a pull system, the sharing of information will be from the actual demand, which is coming from the customer. And here, I think this is the repetitive discussion that for supply chain coordination, all the stage they needs to be aligned together to maximize the supply chain surplus or profitability. And again, there is an example over here. It's again the discussion of pull system or push system. As you can see here in a pull system, if you have one manufacturer and one supplier in one cycle, so in this regard, if it's a kind of pull system, it means that the manufacturer here is the customer and the supplier is the supplier of this customer. So the manufacturer must share demand and production information with the supplier. But let's see this question. What would be the situation in a push system? Let's assume that in a push system, you have in one cycle, you have supplier and you have a customer. So in this regard, the supplier should share, kind of supply and delivery information with the manufacturer. So now, guys, it's important to understand the difference or the impact of pull system and push system to understand the direction of flow from one point to another point. So, in general, we can conclude that if we are dealing in a pull system, so no matter which cycle we are discussing, in any cycle, we can consider one supplier, one manufacturer. And if it's a kind of manufacturing cycle, so then you will have supplier and manufacturer. So in a pull system, the information will go from upstream. In pull system, the information will be shared from to upstream. So it means that the information will be shared from manufacturer toward the supplier. But in a push system, the information direction will be shared from the upstream to downstream. So if you have one supplier and manufacturer, so information of the supply of raw materials should be shared with the manufacturer. The other decision that could be answered by information driver is sales and operations planning. We will have some discussion in other chapters related to SOP, but generally I would say that in SOP, we are going to make a balance between the production and inventory across our supply chain with the amount of sales that we are targeting to make it realize. So when we are coordinating the production and inventory level across whole supply chain with the targeted sale level, so it means that we are in SOP concept. And for sure that will affect on the demand of supplier and also the amount of product that we are supplying to our customers. So in our factory, by doing sales and operation planning, it means that we are considering the amount of raw material that should be demanded and they should be supplied from the supplier, and also we are going to provide for our customer. But this is just very brief introduction that would be discussed in another chapters of this book. Okay, let's see some of the enabling technology in the field of information system. Some of the enabling technology, and I believe that you must have heard about some of this technology. For example, the first and very kind of old technology was electronic data interchange. It just goes back to 70s, and then at that time they could use this kind of technology to facilitate the release of kind of order or purchase. But nowadays this kind of technology, they have been replaced by new technology. And the second one is internet. All you know what is the internet, so it's a kind of medium of communication in the world and then also in the supply chain. If you remember, in a supply chain, we have three microprocess: customer relationship management, internal supply chain management, and supplier relationship management. For all this microprocess, at the moment, application of internet is inevitable. I mean, we cannot manage microprocess without having the internet. And the other enabling technology you may heard about it is enterprise resource planning, or ERP. And basically they are, providing a kind of a tracking system of information. Any kind of transaction which is happening in the supply chain, you can track the information because all the information are shared through a kind of centralized database. And it's in an ideal situation, most of the decisions are made in a kind of online and also in a centralized manner, and all parties, they are coordinating with each other to increase the surplus of a supply chain. So ERP system, they are just maybe kind of new. They have started at most maybe in last decade, and still they are in a progress. And there are many kind of enterprise resource planning software which has been developed for a different company. And maybe one of the ERP system which has been recently installed in Geotech Lab is SAP. But the other one, which is more dedicated for supply chain, is a supply chain management software, which is using a kind of ERP system. But inside that ERP system, we have also a kind of a platform which is supporting our analytical decision making process. So whenever you wanted to make an analytical decision to determine, okay, how much transportation should be sent to which customer, how would be the amount of production, how would be the amount of inventory. All this kind of analytical decision will be made by that software, which is supported by a kind of ERP system. So all the information inside the factory, and also we are receiving some information from supplier, from the customer. So by having all those shared information, we can just make a better decision. This is the idea of SCM software. The other enabling technology is RFID identification, or just RFID. And the technology, it's still kind of new. There are some radio frequency tag. They should be attached to the ones which is supposed to be tracked into the system. So, and now they are getting more attention in developing logistic and supply system. So they are helping to better tracking system and better monitoring the level of inventory inside the warehouse. You can track the the movement of items inside the manufacturing, and so on. And just as the one good example of RFID, if you could implement RFID into a warehouse in the docking area, then maybe you can just remove some workers that they are counting and they are scanning the barcode. So rather than scanning the barcode and just counting the items, if they have been attached by some RFID tags, so all the process could be done by RFID system. So these are just some examples of enabling technology related to information system in a supply chain. And for information decision, there are some metrics that should be tracked by a manager. One of those metrics is forecast horizon. And usually the forecast horizon is determining in which time interval we are going to make our decision. And just as a simple rule of thumb, usually the forecast horizon, they should be more than the lead time of our decision. So for example, if the lead time of our decision is going to be 1 month or 2 months, so it's better to consider forecast horizon for at least 1 season. And if, for example, the lead time of decision is going to be 1 season, so it's better to consider forecast horizon for half year or 1 year. And what would be the frequency of our decision? How much frequent we are just making our decision and updating our forecast? And the other metrics is the forecast error. If you remember from logistic management, when you are making a forecast, maybe the actual demand and your forecast, there might be some gap. And then it's important to measure that amount of gap. The other metrics is seasonal factor, which is measuring the difference between average demand in each period of time with the average demand for whole year. So if it's they are close to each other, it means that we have a seasonal factor which is close to 1. It's showing that it's a kind of a stable demand. But if we see that the seasonal factor is high, it's showing that the demand in 1 season could be so far away from the demand for whole year. So, and that would be kind of the case for some products such as clothes, that in winter season there is a huge amount of demand for some kind of warm clothes, and then during the summer the trend is changing. And the other metrics is the variance from the plan. And in a supply chain, you are just making a kind of a plan. And based on your plan, you are thinking that maybe in next season, we are going to reach to a specific level of production. But in reality, maybe there would be a kind of difference between the amount of production that you have planned and the amount of production which has been realized. And then that is important to track that amount of variance, and then you can just make adjustment to come back to the the amount of anticipated plan. And the last metric, which is kind of related to bullwhip effect, is the ratio of demand variability to the order variability. I mean, demand variability is coming from the customer, and order variability is coming from the kind of supplier. If they are close to each other, it means that the impact of bullwhip effect is low. But if there is a significant difference between demand variance and order variance, it means that usually the demand variance of customer is lower than the demand or order variance by the supplier. And then that will impose a kind of bullwhip effect, which is the concept of discussion in other chapters. So just as a very brief understanding of bullwhip effect, Whenever there is a variance or fluctuation in the demand of the customer, that will result in some variability or fluctuations in the orders by the supplier, because they are just trying to adjust the operation with the demand of the customer. And if less amount of variance and demand is imposing huge amount of variance by the supplier orders, it means that the bulk effect is huge, and then we need to come up with a better coordination. But if the variance of customer and supplier, they are close to each other, it means that the bulk effect is not going to be, dangerous to our supply chain. And just as the last slide for the information, I would say that in information, we are going to have a kind of trade-off between complexity and the value. We know that for sure, good information and necessary information helps to improve efficiency and responsiveness, but we don't want to get too much information, because too much information is just bringing more complexity and more cost to the system. We just wanted to keep right amount of information which is necessary to coordination purposes. Okay, the next drivers in supply chain is sourcing. So the next driver is sourcing. What we are going to do through the sourcing, we want to, in our supply chain, through the sourcing, we want to determine which task will be done by which source. You can guess what is the idea of sourcing. We want to find the source for performing our operation. And the main question over here is that, are we going to our operation or task internally or through a third party, maybe producer, third party warehouse, third party transportation, or so on? If the task, either it could be production, warehousing, and distribution or transportation. If these three tasks, they are done internally, so that would be the source is internal. But in the other side, maybe we decide to outsource production or distribution or warehousing to a third party. And I believe that as a logistics student, you have heard this third party concept in the other courses. And but you can just postpone some of your operation and task to a third party company, and some tasks could be done internally. And one example that I mentioned is Grainger. They are outsourcing the package delivery to a third party logistic. And the reason is easy, because the third party logistic, the cost of transportation by third party logistic is less than the cost if Grainger wanted to deliver the package to customer by itself. So when they see that the transportation by a third party company, which are more sophisticated in doing this task, is cheaper, so they are just postponing or outsourcing transportation to a third party logistic. But in the other side, for the warehousing operation, they are using their own warehouses, because they have a great warehouses with a sufficient capacity, and then they can justify this decision by warehousing through their internal warehouses. So you see, one part of task, which is package delivery, is done by a third party. One part of task, which is warehousing, is done internally. And recently, in the last 2 decades, we can say that the globalization has created the huge options for sourcing. By having the internet on hand, and also by the impact of internet as the globalization, we can see that for sourcing, we can find maybe sometimes 10 or 100 options available as the source, but also we need to consider some potential risks might be imposed by some kind of third-party supplier. So there are some decisions that we need to take about sourcing. As I said, one of the decisions is, are we going to do a task internally, in-house here? It means that internally, or are we going to outsource that task? And whenever we want to make or outsource one task, the amount of benefit which is added to the supply chain should be significant, because we need to be careful for some kind of task, for some kind of risk. Whenever you are outsourcing a part of a task to another company as a subcontractor, there is always a risk which you are adding to your system. So whenever we are outsourcing one part of, task to a subcontractor, a kind of risk is inevitable. Why? Because that subcontractor is under your control. It's a kind of outsource. It's out of the scope of your power. So maybe they just shift some strategy, and then that will bring some kind of risk to your supply chain. The other decision related to sourcing is supplier selection, which is a kind of interesting topic in our bachelor thesis. Each year that we are running bachelor thesis topics, there are some students, they are working on the supplier selection project. So for each company, you need to search for some supplier to fulfill the part of task. And then the evaluation and ranking of the supplier is also important. So they can just implement some ranking method to evaluate supplier based on some criteria, and then they can suggest the best supplier to the company. And the other decision related to sourcing is about the procurement, and this is the course that I think you are studying in this semester, if I'm right. And through this course, you are just learning the process of, obtaining raw materials or final product or services in a supply chain. Okay, at the end, we need to understand some metrics related to the sourcing, and here is the list of metrics. The first metric is days payable outstanding, and if you want to know, the definition is simple. How many days will take to to get paid when you have done one task. So when the task is complete and then the payment is done, that time interval is considered as the days payable accounting. This is one metric in sourcing. The other metric is the purchase price. The other metric is the range of purchase price, the quantity of purchase, the quality of the supplier, the lead time of supplier. So these are a kind of, metrics that should be tracked by the manager regarding the sourcing drivers in a supply chain.